Welcome. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar. This is part of our Unpacking Coaching webinar series presented by the National Center for Pyramid Model Innovations. My name is Mary Louise Hemmeter, and I'm going to be hosting this session today. Our topic today is using the Equity Coaching Guide to address culturally responsive pyramid model practices. I want to go over a couple of details before we get started. First, this webinar is going to be recorded, and a recording of it will be made available on our website at challengingbehavior.org. During the webinar, as Jolene is talking, you'll be able to type in questions in the Q&A box, and we'll try to address some of those questions towards the end of the webinar. Any questions that we're not able to address, we'll record answers to your questions, and those will be posted on our website at a later date. I just want to let you know that after the webinar, you'll be receiving an evaluation from us. We would really appreciate you filling it out. We take your feedback really seriously, and it will help us to make good decisions about future webinar topics. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Jolena Farrow, who is going to be leading our discussion today. Jolena.
Hi, hello everybody, and thank you for joining us today. Let me just say a couple of words about the project in which we developed the Equity Coaching Guide, and also that I am at the University of South Florida, and I'm part of the National Center for Pyramid Model Innovations there. 2 years ago, we got a grant that we called the PEP grant, the Pyramid Equity Project grant. It was a 2-year grant, and it was, we were given it so we could address suspension and expulsion and disproportionate discipline practices around suspension and expulsion through the pyramid model. We had a large team that included the University of Colorado at Denver. We had people at, of course, USF, at Vanderbilt, and at the University of Oregon. We modified some materials that we use in the pyramid model, and we also developed a bunch of materials. And this Equity Coaching Guide was one of the things that we developed to address culturally responsive practices and implicit bias. Okay, so when we talk about disproportionate disciplinary practices in early childhood, we know from the national data that boys are suspended and expelled more often than girls are, and we know that there's also disproportionality around race, so that African American children are suspended and expelled more often than their white peers in preschool programs. We define suspension and expulsion in the way that you see on the screen here. So we're looking at in-school suspension that people don't always think about when you think of an early childhood program, but we define in-school suspension as time in another classroom. So if you send the child out of the room to be in another classroom with a teacher, they may be missing learning opportunities, and that's a suspension from that classroom, or temporarily removing them from a classroom to be with an adult where they're also missing or losing learning opportunities. We define out-of-school suspension as being sent home for the remainder of the day or being sent home for 1 or more days. So short-term and long-term out-of-school suspensions. And we know, and I'm sure many of us, if not all of us, have had experience in which we've been in a program where that occurs very frequently. So children are not just sent home early one day for the remainder of the day, but they may be sent home, their parents ask to pick them up early every day for a number of days. So out of school suspension, that's how we're defining it. And then of course dismissal or leaving the program, which is expulsion. We also, because of data that we have collected, know that there's also disproportionate discipline practices around the frequency of behavior incidents reported for specific groups of children. So we may see more frequent behavior incidents reported in a classroom and in a program that are related to race, ethnicity, IEP status, gender, or children who are dual language learners. Okay, so we're going to talk about some tools that we modified and developed for specifically for the classroom, because we're talking about coaching, obviously. And the first thing that let me say that differently. One of the things that we did was that we modified the behavior incident reporting system. So I don't know if all of you know what that is, but just very briefly, it's a system whereby teachers can record challenging behavior in children and what it is, and then kind of the factors around it and what they do about it within the classroom system. And what we did to it was we added information, demographic information about the children, so that it can report whether or not there are more incidents for Hispanic children, more incidents for children that are dual language learners that are not in proportion to their enrollment in the school, so that we get an equity report from the behavior incident reporting system. We looked at the pyramid model or teaching pyramid observation tool, but we didn't make any changes in it because we feel like there's already many of the factors that are related to culturally responsive practice in it. So factors or items related to parent engagement, family and cultural and family and home information coming into the classroom. So we didn't change that, but what we did was develop this pyramid model equity coaching guide that provides a more focused look at culture around those practices in the classroom, or a kind of a deeper look around it. And the pyramid model coaching guide is what we're going to be looking at today. Okay, so when we talk about disproportionate discipline, we know that there are a couple of words that people talk about all the time when they're talking about it. So one is implicit bias, which is unconscious, which promotes excuse me, just a minute. Sorry. It's unconscious and it promotes stereotypes. And so we know that we can be interacting with somebody in a way that we're unconscious of, but which is based on an interaction based on an implicit bias. And so that was one of the things that we looked at when we were looking at suspension and expulsions and early childhood practices. We developed some training around implicit bias and also culturally responsive practices. When we think about culturally responsive practices, I want you to think about having a strength-based perspective, which means the culture, the strengths of the culture. We're looking at the strengths of the family in the home. We're looking at the strengths of the child rather than the differences and the weaknesses. That it's inclusive of multiple cultural norms. So we often in our programs, we have a culture represented, but maybe not all of the cultures in the classroom. And one of the things that we have to keep in mind is that let's take Hispanic, the Hispanic culture, for example. So we know that that's not a homogeneous group. You're not just Hispanic. There are many cultures within that label. And so we need to be thinking about that as we think about, are we including all of the cultures? Are there multiple cultural norms? That part of being culturally responsive is to engage in strong reciprocal relationships with families. And I want you to hear the word reciprocal. So lots of times we're giving families information, we're trying to bring them along, help them understand what we're doing. We're working with them in that way, but are we getting information from them? Are we taking information about their culture and including it in our program? Are we asking for their input and really using their input, and are we treating their input with respect? So it has to be reciprocal. The next thing is integrating the cultural context of children's home in the preschool program. And I think that a lot of our schools do that very well. A lot of our preschool programs do that very well, so that we're bringing materials from the home. Some programs bring the families in to talk about their family and their culture. So we want to be sure, though, that we're integrating that context into the preschool program. We want to include the language used in the home so that children hear words. Maybe you just can learn a few words, so that children learn those words that are being used in their home that are in a different language. And we want to be sure that we're developing conversations and that we're addressing conflicts between the cultural norms of the family and the norms that we're developing in the preschool. Okay, so this is the first page of the Pyramid Model Equity Coaching Guide. It's an instruction page. And there are just a couple of things I want to say about the guide before we look further into it. One is that it takes pyramid model practices. It asks a question that you'll probably recognize from other pyramid model practice questions, and looks at them through an equity lens, so that we're just asking you to kind of look a little deeper. We have examples that help you do that. It's not a fidelity of implementation measure. It's not meant to be done by somebody who goes into the classroom and starts checking off whether or not they see those things in the classroom. It's a reflection that the coach does that happens after you've done the teapot, for example. And it's very much a part of the collaborative practice-based coaching process. So you don't want to do it if you haven't already developed a relationship with the coach. The questions, the information that you identify can be very tough, have a very tough conversation with a coach, or with a teacher. So you want to make sure that you already have that collaborative relationship. Okay, when you use the guide. So I try to tell everybody that you use the guide if you think there might be an equity issue. One of the things that you might see that identifies an equity issue is that you are using the behavior incident reporting system and you get an equity alert. So that alert tells you that there's an issue, that a specific group of children are receiving BIRs, behavior incident reports, disproportionately to their enrollment in the classroom. So that would trigger maybe doing the equity guide. One of the ways the teachers that I've worked with use it is if they have a child with behavior concern and they're trying to gather as much information as they possibly can about what's going on with the child. They're looking at the classroom and how the classroom is set up. They're looking at their teapot to see what kinds of issues there might be on the teapot. But they want to go a little deeper and look at, are there cultural practices that we might, or cultural materials or things like that we might include in the classroom that we haven't, and that would help with this problem behavior. If you have a teapot that indicates few family connections, then that's another time that you might want to look at the equity coaching guide. So you want to increase family connections regardless of thinking about whether you have an equity alert, but this gives you kind of a more deeper understanding of what kind of connections you might build with the families, and so that's another time that you might do it. Or if observations indicate that family engagement could be improved, so that you see in your observations that there are few people volunteering in the classroom, or that the volunteers only are from one cultural group and the classroom has 3 or 4 different groups of kids. So that's another time that you want to use it. But the final thing on here is if the preschool program decides that equity is a priority for them, They want to really know how well they're doing or if they need to make any changes. And then the leadership team of that program may say, let's do one in each classroom because we're making equity a priority. And you may not have any other kind of alerts going on. All right, before you use the guide, you want to have assessed classroom practices with the teapot. So you already have an idea of whether the teacher is implementing best practice in the classroom. You want to have established a strong collaborative coaching partnership with the teacher and the other classroom staff. And you want to have been in the classroom a little bit. So, so you've done the teapot. You maybe have had your first round with the teacher as far as coaching the teacher. You've set up some goals, and then you're kind of back in the classroom doing some informal observations, just kind of looking around to see how things are. You use the guide with other data. So if you have not already looked at the BIR summaries of incident reports in the classroom, you probably want to pull those out so you can see what kind of incident reports you're getting, and then look at the teapot practices and see how they are connected to maybe the BIR behavior incident reports. You want to look at classroom products and records. So you're walking around, you want to look at what kind of materials in the classroom. You want to see if there is information about, and you want to look at information about families volunteering in the classroom, how often the teacher talks to their families, what kinds of interactions they have. And then you may have done some other classroom assessments. Look at those too. So you may have done an ECHRS, or you may have done a class. Look at those two to see if they give you any other information. All right, so how to use the guide. So the first thing is to identify the purpose. Are you using the guide because you've been in the classroom and you just feel like you want to get a better feel for classroom practices around culture? Are you using it because the program has identified equity as a concern and they just want all the classrooms to have it? Are you using it because you have a behavior problem in the classroom, or you have behavior incident reports that indicate there's an equity concern? So think about what your purpose is as you begin it, because you can do all of the reflective questions. There are 18 of them. You can complete all of them. Or maybe your purpose is that you think that there are, for example, transitions, or the teacher's not doing well with transitions in this program. Then you can just do part of the equity guide that deals with transitions as well to give you a deeper understanding of that issue. You can do it in one or all classrooms. There are 4 steps in the equity guide. The first step is to read the questions, reflect on the questions. The second step is, if you have a concern about a specific question, you prioritize the concern so that you're, just as you would it when you're doing a teapot, you may prioritize which goals you're going to address first. You identify, the third step is to identify resources. So for each question, we have a list of resources that you can access about that particular area or item. And then the fourth part is about reflection and feedback. It gives you some information about ways to do that so that you're addressing any concerns that you have. I'm going to talk about those specifically. All right, so this is just the first couple of questions, reflective questions in the equity guide, and this is how all of it is set up. You can, by the way, get the equity guide as a hard copy, so you can download it from our website as a hard copy and fill it out paper and pencil, or it's also online, and so you can do it online as well. So the first question, let me just give you this example. Do learning centers and activities include materials, songs, visuals that are aligned with the culture and interest of children in the classroom? And underneath it, in italics, we have some examples of what you might be looking for, what you might see in the classroom that indicates that the cultures are being identified, that the activities reflect the cultures of the families in the program and the children. Then you just mark whether or not you have a concern, which is no. No, the question is answered no, I do have a concern, and you write that down. Or do you not have a concern? And then the question is yes, yes, learning centers and activities include materials, et cetera, that reflect the cultures of the children in the classroom. So there are no concerns. And you do that throughout the 18 questions, identifying concerns or no concerns. All right, I think that, I think because I do think that the practices, the questions are kind of loosely in 3 themes, and these are them. So we have questions around classroom practices, such as schedules, positive relationships, transitions, routines, around family engagement. Specifically, we're looking at, are they bidirectional? Are they reciprocal? Are you doing practical strategies with the families? Are there discussions if there are differences between what you're doing and what the family is doing at home? And then around behavioral interventions. So are they individualized? Do they have cultural fit? So do they fit the culture of the families and children that you're working with? And is there a standard process so that you're actually addressing all children in the same way and not just a few of the children in different ways? Okay, the second step is to prioritize. And that means look at your concerns and just kind of figure out which ones you want to work on first. And then when you do that, identify additional sources of data that might help you understand or get more information about that concern, and so that you're identifying whether this is an equity or an implicit bias concern. Is there something that I can do about this that really relates to cultural competence and culturally responsive practices? These are our resources. So some of the questions are grouped together with resources that kind of address all of the questions. In this case, the first 4 questions have resources, and this is our online version, and so you see that there are links directly to the resource, which I think it makes it so much easier to use it. We have resources from all over. Because we looked at everything we could think of. We have some from National Center for Quality Teaching and Learning. We have some from NAEYC, and we have some are videos, some are fact sheets, some are research papers, so that there's just a variety of things. The resources are for the coach to look at them to get ideas for what to work with the teacher with, but the coach may also want to give the teacher some of these resources. And then finally, we have the reflection and feedback step, in which we just have some conversation starters and then specific questions around equity, or some things that you might have found when you were going through your concerns, the reflective questions. So, so conversation starters that you might use as any coach would use, like describe what happened when so you saw something in the classroom, you have an equity concern about it, and so you ask the coach, what happened when you did blah, 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 so that you can get them to start talking about it. There might be specific questions like, show me practices in your classroom that are culturally responsive. What we're trying to engage in culturally responsive practices in our program. Can you show me what you think or what you feel like you've added to your class that is culturally responsive, or what you were doing before that you feel like is very culturally responsive? Or I'd like to hear more about what you do in this particular situation. And then the final part of that section of the equity guide are tips for working through resistance. So, when a teacher doesn't agree with what you have to say, then of course you want to engage in a conversation. But teachers may be especially resistant, and I'm saying thinking teachers and everybody else, maybe especially resistance when you start talking about implicit bias. And so there are some tips for working through resistance. And just the URL at the bottom is challengingbehavior.org, and implementation/equity will get you directly to the equity guide. All right, I'm going to give you a couple of examples before we go to questions of how the guide has been used. All right, first, I had a coach that I was working with, and she had a child who had aggressive behavior and had gotten a lot of behavior incident reports. And so she had written a behavior plan done an FBA and written a behavior plan for that child. I know that not all coaches do work with children with the challenging behavior, work in that way, doing an FBA, but this particular coach did. That was part of her role in the program. She had written a plan, we had worked on it, the teacher was part of her writing that plan, so the teacher and the teacher assistant were very much involved in the plan. They implemented it, they had to make a few changes. There was some improvement, but it just wasn't going as well as she'd like it to. The child happened to be Hispanic. The teacher was also Hispanic. She spoke Spanish. She had lots of cultural stuff in her classroom that related to the Hispanic or Latino culture. But we did was we said, she said, well, let's go through that was the first time she had been through it, actually. And she said, let's go through the equity guide and just see what I get from that. And so this is the very first question. We already looked at this question. Do learning centers include activities and materials that are aligned with the cultures and interests of the children in the classroom? And she stopped right there. I mean, we eventually finished the whole thing, but she stopped right there and she said, you know what? There is nothing from this child's classroom or culture in this classroom. And in fact, I have a couple of classrooms like that. And this is a place that really did very well with the teachers spoke the language of the families. There was lots of material around the room. But when I said, remember I said, you know, you need to really also think about multiple cultural perspectives, then you need to think about how many different cultures you have in your school, in your program, and also address all of them. So she went back to the teacher and they talked about how they could add some things from the family. They brought the parents in and that really helped the child. Second example. This is a program who is using our behavior incident reporting system. This is their equity alert. This is what it looks like. And the red part is where the alert is. So there is an alert about race, ethnicity in the equity profile. You can see that we're also tracking gender, we're tracking IEP status, and we're tracking dual language learner status as well. So, and we're tracking incidents, suspensions in and out of school, and dismissals. So the program got an equity alert, and we developed an equity profile. This actually comes as part of the program, the profile. You have to kind of pull out the numbers, but it's pretty easy to do. And this was the profile. So we found that Hispanic children were receiving more BIRs than, and that's again behavior incident reports, than you could account for their total child enrollment. So about 2.5 times more likely to have at least one BIR than all other children. So we now have an equity alert, and we also learned that those children with the BIRs are clustered in 3 classrooms. So now when we're doing the equity coaching guide, we want to look across the 3 classrooms, right? Because we have similar issues in the 3 classrooms. So the coach completed the reflective questions in all 3 of those classrooms. She began, and she had concerns across all 3 classrooms, but when she prioritized first classroom practices, and she identified elements across classroom practices that were common to each classroom. And that element that she started with was teaching behavioral expectations. So the teachers in none of those classrooms were not really teaching behavioral expectations through a cultural lens. They were teaching behavioral expectations. There were behavioral expectations, but they weren't. Were some off things about related to the culture. So, based on what she learned from the information that she got when she went to our resources, she added photos of the children in the classroom who are engaging in those expectations. So it became much more personal to the children. She talked to the parents, and so when I say she, I mean the coach and the teachers talked to the parents and got examples of different cultural experiences that might be relevant to those behavioral expectations, so that the children were hearing words that were related to what they knew they did at home and, you know, in their community. And in one case, she accommodated differences in the rules, such as eye contact. So she had a child whose parents had taught him not to look teachers in the eye, and I'm looking at my guide so I can tell you what it says. So one of our questions is, do teachers use multiple examples, visuals, and cultural experiences to teach behavior expectation in a manner that relates to all children? And then one of the examples is, teachers change circle time rules from eye on teacher to eyes are looking, so that the child doesn't have to be necessarily looking at the teacher, which was part of their culture, not for them not to do that. So those are just a couple of examples of the different ways that you use the guide and the different pieces of information that you can get from the guide. Okay, we're open for questions now.
Okay, thanks, Jolena. That was great. So we have some questions. I have several questions that I'm going to pose. And again, as I said, the ones that we don't get to, we'll record some answers to them at a later date and get back to you. So I'm going to kind of organize these kind of as general things, and then I'll get down to a few more specific questions. So I think the first question for me, because I assume that most of the participants on the call are familiar with the pyramid model. And when you say culturally responsive pyramid model practices, is that something different than what we've always thought is the pyramid model, or or is it just more, has it just been made more articulated better?
No, it's not different. It really isn't different, which is why we didn't change the teapot and the guides that are written as part of the pyramid model and the practices that when you look at the modules. No, those are culturally responsive practices. And it was, I think, one of the reasons that the pyramid model was chosen, that we were chosen to do this kind of work, is because the pyramid model already does that. But the idea is that we want to make that more explicit. And one of the ways we did it through this equity guide is just by asking the questions and giving examples that were just, you know, a little different enough so that you're really focused on, is this, you know, am I really addressing the culture in my classrooms?
Great. I mean, I think the issue is that we always intended the pyramid model practices to be culturally responsive, and maybe in this project have just made those connections far more clear, much more clear for people. So
and I think added data as well that helps us look at it more explicitly.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So I just want to ask one other question, which about kind of practices generally, but it seems like we've spent some time as a center thinking about disciplinary practices that are not delivered equitably and have focused primarily on inappropriate discipline practices. And I'm wondering if the kind of opposite of that is that we should be monitoring whether we're implementing supportive discipline practices or positive supportive practices equitably across kids. So it might not be that we're suspending and expelling kids disproportionately, but really that we're applying positive practices disproportionately. And is there a way to kind of help teachers think about that?
Sure. So the coaching, the equity coaching guide does ask questions that kind of are asking you, are those positive practices in place? Okay. And I'm going to pull the coaching guide out again.
Okay.
And just give you an example. So question number 6 says, do teachers provide positive descriptive feedback for children's skills, behaviors, and activities to every child? And so we kind of added every, and then the examples are, the teachers are already monitoring their use of descriptive feedback so that they know that they are giving it to every child. Or the teachers have a system that is set up so that there's some sort of permanent product, like they give the child a leaf when they're being kind, and that goes on a tree. And then you can just look and see, are all of the children getting those leaves, or is there somebody who's being left out? When I was working in you probably hate to hear about kindergarten through 12, but when I was working K-12 PBIS, one of the things that we did was ask the students, are you getting, do you get positive feedback for what you do? And there were ways to check on it. And one of them was to look at the tickets that teachers gave out, or whatever their, positive reinforcement system was. And when you have that, then it's easier to do. I would say that if the coach has a concern that that's happening, so if you're in a classroom and you think, well, I see 3 kids over in the corner and they just have not gotten any positive, they're being quiet, but they haven't gotten any positive feedback at all. And the teacher's concentrated here, or the boys don't get positive feedback, but the girls do, or something like that. That's a time when that extra observation might come into play. So the coach goes in and watches, and you can do a very simple data collection by just having a list of kids and marking, yes, the teacher gave positive feedback to that child during my observation, so that you can get a good idea of that.
Yeah, because I think that I think there's the danger of not applying those practices to children whose behavior is we're having to spend a lot of time addressing their behavior. And so we don't spend as much time on those positive things. But I think we can also overlook quiet, kind of withdrawn children and not apply those practices. So
right.
I love those suggestions.
Right. And also, when you think about it, children who may be speaking a different language at home may be those quiet children. They're not hearing their language at school. So what can you do to give them positive feedback? Maybe learn a word that is positive feedback in their language. So
great. Perfect. So, Jolena, we had a question that it kind of fits with this discussion. So I want to just pose it to you and we can talk a little bit about this. So as you started talking earlier about teapot data, one of our participants said, well, what if the program doesn't use the teapot? And I'm wondering if you want to respond to that, and I can add some thoughts as well.
Well, okay, so let me just respond in this way, and I'm sure you'll have other things to say. I think if you don't use the teapot, you have to use something that gives you that foundational understanding of the social emotional practices in the classroom. That you really probably shouldn't do this just without having that foundation. That's why we say that you should do the teapot first. So that this will help you dig deeper into it, but you have to first know, well, is the teacher doing transitions well? Are there materials in the classroom that are supposed to be there? Is there a schedule? Are there rules? If you don't already know those things, then these questions won't help you as much. They won't, because the foundation isn't there.
Yeah, so I mean, my thought about that is pretty consistent with what you're saying, Jolena, but mostly I think if we're doing coaching, and I realize this isn't a webinar on practice-based coaching specifically, but if you're doing coaching, you have to have an articulated set of practices that you're coaching on and a way to measure those. And so if you're coaching teachers around the pyramid, there needs to be something that allows you to collect information on what progress the teacher's making on those practices. And there are ways you can use other things like the inventory of practices that's on our website, but it's hard to think how you could really do this systematically without TPOT data. So.
I would agree with that.
Okay, so there was a question about the guide, which was, does the coach complete the guide alone, or would this typically be done together with the teacher?
You know, I was thinking about that when I was going through this and preparing for this. And I thought, I believe it's best done if the coach starts alone, but that, excuse me, but then going through it with the teacher would be a really good idea, because it's those questions will help the teacher reflect as well.
Okay, cool. So I have one more big picture question, and then I want to back up and ask a question that a participant had around suspensions. But the kind of big picture question, or whatever, is one of our participants said, thank you for the very informative presentation, so thank you. And she was wondering if there are any tools to measure change in teachers' implicit bias, and then she posed, how can we know we are changing attitudes and perspectives?
I think that that's an excellent question. And so I'm going to answer it in this way, though. One, I don't know of any tools that have been developed that have actually been tested to make sure that they're measuring implicit bias. There are lots of kind of activities that you can do that help you recognize that you have some biases. Actually, if you go to our website and look on our equity page, we actually have some webinars that Dr. Rosemary Allen has done, in which they talk a little bit about some of those things. She also did our training for the demonstration projects that we had for our PEP program. And she used some of those activities. So I don't know, but I don't know of anything that'll let you measure implicit bias and then check off, yes, the teacher has changed their bias. I also think it's not something that you can do, you know, in just a short period of time, that it really takes some conversation. So one of our demonstration sites, the one I was working with in New Jersey during this project, decided to set aside some time at each staff meeting to talk about implicit bias and culturally responsive practices that after they had done the training. And so it was an ongoing conversation. And I have to tell you that as we went through this project, I really had to look at my biases. Like, I really like boys better than girls. So I am, you know, giving more positives to the boys than the girls. So, and that's, you know, the same kind of thing. We don't all have the same bias. We aren't all, but I would say we all do have a bias that is unconscious. And what we want to do is make sure that it's out front, that we're really looking at it.
I wonder, I agree. I mean, I would have answered that in the same way in terms of not knowing whether we have really good tools. I think how we change people's implicit bias and how we measure that is we're probably in the infancy of that in our field. But I do think that one other thing about it is that what are the things that we would expect to see teachers do if they were aware of their implicit biases, or if they were making progress? And I think it would be that we would see them using data. I think it would be that we would see changes in who they were giving BIRs on. I mean, there are some things that we might see teachers do that would represent that maybe they're making progress in how they view different groups of kids. All right, so I have one last question,
Okay.
Jolena, and this is I don't know that there's a right or wrong answer to this, but one of our participants at the beginning of the webinar, when you were talking about in-school suspensions and out-of-school suspensions, asked the question, is a modified attendance plan as part of a behavior plan? So I guess the modified attendance has been written into the behavior plan. Is that then considered an out-of-school suspension?
So I can say no, that is not being considered an out-of-school suspension, but I would also say that is a plan that helps make it easier for the teacher and the program, and that you don't want to stay with that. You don't want to stay with a plan that I mean, that's not really a behavior change plan. It's just cutting down the amount of time that you have to work with that child. What you want to do is eventually you want to start increasing the time so that the child is not on a modified school day the whole time they're in the program, but that they're gradually, as their behavior changes, they're gradually spending more and more time in the program. When I teach students and teachers how to do behavior incident or behavior intervention plans and FBAs, that's really the response that I give them. That yes, I can see that due to the circumstances that having a partial day will work, but that's not really changing the child's behavior. That's just giving you less time to work with them. So let's work toward making it a longer day.
So I had 20 minutes to ponder that question. So I had a couple of other thoughts. I don't disagree with you at all, Jolena, but I had a couple of other thoughts. And one was that, you know, what goes on a behavior plan should be related to what we know about the function of the child's behavior and what we know about the kind of triggers of the child's behavior. And so it should only be on the behavior plan if it somehow will soften those triggers, or in other words, it just putting it on the behavior plan because we want him to be here less isn't a good reason to have it on the plan. But if it's somehow related to what we know and understand about the behavior, then it makes sense for it to be on the behavior plan. The other thing, and again, I'm just reading the question that a person posed, and so I don't know enough about it to be real clear here. But the other thing I would say is that I would want to stay away from people thinking, if we write this on the plan, it's okay to do it, right? And if the plan's not written with the family, then I could see how it might be considered a suspension. If it's just because it seems possible that if a behavior plan was written by a program without input from the family and the, modified attendance plan wasn't related to the behavior, that then it might be a form of suspension. I don't know what you think about that.
No, I really agree with that. The last part about it might be suspension is a little, I wasn't thinking of it in that nuanced way, but I think you're right, that if the family, I guess I'm assuming that the family is included in writing a behavior intervention plan, and that and in the functional behavior assessment, so that, and that means the family and the teacher and everybody. And I know that that's not true in all places, but I wasn't thinking about that when I answered the question. But the first part, that's really what I meant, what you said, that I know that people put them on the plans, but it's not really supposed to be part of the plan. It's just something you're doing to try to manage the kind of what happens in the school. You're trying to manage it for a short period of time, but you can't stay there regardless of where it is. It's not okay to stay there, and it's not really a behavioral intervention. needs to be changed so that wherever that piece of information is, that you're gradually increasing the amount of time that the child's in the program, if for whatever reason that you have not kept them in the program for very long.
Yeah, so if we want children to be in our program, whatever time they should be in our program anyway, having them not come isn't helping them learn the skills they need to be able to be in that program. So anyway, very good questions, guys. So I am gonna kind of wrap up at this point. Thank you all for sending those questions. Those were very helpful. So we're asking you again nicely to please fill out the email survey that we'll send you in right after this, and just imagine this sweet little face looking up at you saying please when you get that link. And then just a couple of other things. I just wanted to remind you to go to our website, and as I said, the webinar will be recorded and will be posted there. There are other webinars. If you've missed our past webinars, the National Center for Pyramid Model Innovations has 3 webinar series, and all of those webinars are recorded. The ones that Jolena just talked about related to the one Rosemary Allen did, those are all recorded and on our website. And I think I responded to this question in the chat box, but now I can't remember. As Jolena, someone had asked a question about would we be posting resources, and I think Jolena's point about the resources being linked in the equity guide will be your best kind of place to find resources. And then we have a newsletter that goes out that kind of tells you about all the new materials coming out from PMI. And you can also sign up for that on the webinar as well. So with that, we're going to conclude our webinar. Thank you so much for being on it. We appreciate it. And we look forward to having you on future webinars.